Okay, this is week 2, lecture 3, and I just want to talk from heart from a little bit. So, as we've made our way through these portions, I want to acknowledge one more barrier that I think probably snags us, and especially as pastors, especially as practitioners of faith, and then probably, depending on the community that we find ourselves in, could impact us fairly significantly. That's this idea of how much do I have really to give? So as practitioners of faith, we find that most of our time is spent giving to others. And as practitioners of faith, it's possible that we deal with our fair share of those who I would say are extra grace required. There is an intentionality with which we have to enter into those relationships. And there's a lack of reciprocity, which means oftentimes we are doing the pouring out and receiving very little from our engagement with them. Which really is the difference between helping someone and becoming friends. Reciprocity is absolutely a necessity when it comes to friendship. But what happens when you take a leap, when you step into a relationship with someone and they don't understand boundaries? They can become a bit high maintenance, and you feel as though you're having to manage those relationships rather than live into the blessing of those relationships. That question in of itself becomes a barrier for neighboring, because we enter into neighboring, we enter into the relationships that we have with one another, assessing already how much is this going to cost me? What is this going to mean for me? What do I have to do here to navigate this relationship well? And as those boundaries are tread upon, as Christians, sometimes we can feel it difficult to draw hard boundaries because we don't want to lack empathy or we don't want to lack compassion. But part of neighboring well is learning how to navigate relationships well by understanding one another's boundaries, understanding that if we're going to do this relationship well, it's going to require the give and take of reciprocity. And so it's important that the steps that we take in neighboring are clear throughout the process of neighboring to ensure that our space and our time is being respected, that the boundaries that we draw are being respected. And those boundaries aren't to keep others out, but to protect the integrity of who we are. And especially in light of some of our personalities, which require a little bit more time to ourselves and others. There are some who are extremely extroverted. They can live out there in the edge and maintain and manage all of those relationships all the time. But there's some of us that are a bit more introverted in the sense that we don't mind or we don't necessarily hate being in relationships with others, but we do have to have the kind of time in which we can draw back, process, listen, be quiet, and not feel like we have to be on all the time. Now, I will say this. I think that really solid neighboring, the kind of neighboring that ultimately should lead us towards friendship, is the kind of neighboring that not only respects those boundaries, but can share space without feeling as though we have to be on, or that someone has to be entertaining, or someone has to be hosting consistently. It can be a shared space, a safe space, a vulnerable space, where those things aren't absolutely necessary all the time. And so in the community that I live in, neighboring comes difficult. I live in one of those kinds of communities where neighbors are seen with a degree of suspicion. What is this going to mean? Is it safe? Can I go down this path again? I've been burned by neighbors before. I've had, as insignificant as it may seem, but I've had people borrow stuff and they've not given it back before. Or how much time are they going to demand in me? It's really creating a kind of culture where our people are willing to take that kind of risk and recognizing that there is an inherent risk in any form of relationship. And yet, if we are going to break out of the rugged individualism that I talked about in the last lecture, it's going to require that we take that risk and that we step into that space and recognize that I am better for the spaces that I share with others, that I am better as I'm stepping into the lives of those closest to me, and that I allow those who are close to me to step into my life. And I think once we grow with people, we begin to discover that what maybe we once would have considered an inconvenience, now we consider just doing life together, the kind of community that affords us life by just sharing that space with one another. So I do think when people have been burned by tread upon boundaries, when people have encountered folks who have taken advantage of their compassion, empathy, friendship, that there is a little bit of a reluctance to immediately jump back into those kinds kinds of relationships. And we've got to recognize that going into it, because those are barriers that we'll have to deal with. And the final thing that I would want to say also in terms of neighboring is that there will be moments where we struggle because of what I would call a cultural mismatch. That we find ourselves in a place or in a neighborhood or in a town or in a community where who we are, how we've been shaped, the perspectives that we have, the identity that has been formed through the connections, the webs of influence, relationships that I've had throughout my life, just don't seem to match well or mix well in the current culture that I find myself in. Now, there is something deeply incarnational and enculturated about learning how to love and live with those, even among those that you find a mismatch. But that is a very real issue that some of us will have to navigate. And it's a difficult space to navigate, because you feel as though there's something wrong with you, because as you seek to love and live like Jesus, there just seems to be this point of disconnect where you just can't find your groove. You just can't share space with people well. You don't understand their ethos, they don't understand yours. You've tried to break down the barriers of language, and still there's a great difficulty. And I don't have any great answers for that, except for to acknowledge it and something to pray through, something to ask God to begin to transform and form your heart, so that you're not allowing maybe some biases that you've let develop, or some prejudices, or even some frustration, maybe even bitterness, because of those disconnects, to continually inform your willingness to enter into meaningful, transformative relational spaces with others. So there's two issues that we're talking about here. The first of which we've talked about on this lecture is this idea of what do you do and how do you navigate those relationships with people who have burned you, taken advantage of you, or crossed your boundaries considerably. How much cost is involved in neighboring? This is something that we'll have to work out through this course. The second of which is, what do you do if there's a cultural mismatch, that as you attempt to neighbor, you just recognize that you don't fit well culturally in that space? Does it require that you, in essence, shake off the dust? And that's not to say that there's anything against them, but maybe you've spoken your piece out, Luke chapter 10, and it's returned back to you, and that piece has not come back to you in the way that means that you can be there long term. Maybe there's a necessity of a move in which you can locate yourself in a space that's more conducive to who you've been shaped and formed to be. Not to say that otherness is bad, or not to say that otherness wouldn't be transformative, but there is a point in which you've got to ask the really, I think, very rubber meets the road kind of question: is there a cultural mismatch here between me and the folks that I seek to minister and stand among?